there with the garlands over your head.
Okay, you know, I could do something about that. I could.
Well, it's kind of evocative.
Is
There we
that
go.
better? I call this the temple of knowledge.
There we go.
I guess that's what a professor is supposed to do.
Hey, Claire, just start recording.
Okay.
Claire?
Copy that.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third event in the visit to campus by John Boros. I'll begin with what I forgot to do yesterday, because I always forget to do something, usually the most important thing. I'll start with the territorial statement. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. So I pointed out that the last phrase in that acknowledgement seems to be a direct result of John's work. Of course, historically, it's also a result of a previous president of the university who infamously gave a speech, one of those classic speeches about how first there was the trees and then the Indigenous people, and then that all disappeared and settlers arrived. That was a very controversial thing at the moment, and I think the university is still embarrassed about it. But we have John's leadership and guidance to show us the way now. I'm not going to introduce John at length again, apart from saying that he's the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. And the reason I'm not going to introduce him at length is that, as we're all discovering, his own introduction of himself is posted on YouTube and is freely available to you. All you have to do is click on the YouTube link for our first meeting on Monday, the 8th of March, and that will take you to the recorded event. I've been told that I was not ready for my close-up at that event, so ignore me and pay attention to John. John, it's worth pointing out that you're actually getting a lot of views asynchronously. By the time you started your second talk yesterday, you'd already had more views asynchronously than you had participants in the original meeting, which was well attended. So this is actually the first lecture in John's visit, the first formal lecture. And the title is Law, Story, Dream, Indigenous Legal Traditions and Narrative Forms. We originally envisioned this lecture as introducing John's notion of drawing out law from narrative sources and dispelling the colonial notion that Indigenous people, quote, live more by habit and custom than by rule of law and order, unquote. That's the quotation from John's book, Drawing Out Law. I don't know if that's still the subject matter. We're about to find out. But please welcome John Boros for his first lecture of this week.
Gwech Minoa, Buju Ginoa, Aninduwe Maganidok. Really good to be with you again. I really appreciated the opportunity to be visiting with everyone over these past couple of days. And I'm speaking to you once more from Wasanich territory here in what is now called Victoria, also Lekwungen territory, and grateful to recognize the Songhees and Esquimalt nations on whose lands I work and play. Today, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about this question of law and narrative and dreams, and in particular, drawing out some of the themes of this book I published in 2010 called Drawing Out Law, A Spirit's Guide, which focused on that dimension of my work. And I think I'll speak for maybe 40 minutes or so, and there perhaps is about 20 minutes of questions, so I look forward to those if you have them. And we'll be finished in an hour. So this idea of dreams is a very big part of Anishinaabe life and law, and it is something that settlers observed when they encountered Anishinaabe people, how we would put a lot of stock or store in our dreams as we were guiding our affairs. And we would often undertake activities if they correlated with those dreams. And it is the case that I think that Indigenous peoples and Anishinaabe peoples are still, by and large, pursuing that course. I told a story yesterday about a pitche, the robin, or the pitchiwak, the robins, that was about a vision quest. And when young people are between 12 to perhaps 18, they fast on the land for 4 days. And in that fasting process, you are hoped to receive some kind of guidance about what your path might be. And we have our own clans that we already come to that process with, but there might be an animal that reveals itself in that. There's some guidance that could be taken, or a bird or a plant or an insect or some other sort of form of life in that way. And that provides some food for thought in the way we proceed. But sometimes that dream might, or vision, might actually be a confirmation of something you've already received. And it becomes deeper in you as a result of that opportunity. And so that Apitchia story, as that young man turned into a robin, was an idea about freedom, but it was also an idea about receiving guidance as to how he was going to find his way through life. When I've done my supervision of graduate students, often if they're Anishinaabe, they'll come to me, and if they haven't had that experience in their youth, they'll present me with some tobacco and say, I would like to go on a vision quest so that not only will I be prepared with my comprehensive exams as I get ready to write my dissertation, but I'll also have this other sense of direction that I can pull from in my life. And so if that's appropriate, I'll accept that tobacco. And we usually spend about a year or so going through stories, going through songs, going through language, talking about the preparation for being alone in a space and choosing a space that experience might occur within. And I've had some students do that here on the coast, and they've chosen mountains around here. And we've approached the local Wisanich, Hulkaminam, Sinchothan, Lekwungen speaking peoples for permission for those activities. And we're fortunate that they've always given their encouragement to that. And so the day comes when people are set out and they have this experience. And likewise, I've also taken students home to my community. Cape Croker, the Neashiwinigaming Indian Reserve, as I mentioned in my first lecture, about 3 hours north of Toronto, 4 hours north of Detroit on the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula, where Georgian Bay weaves in and out and around the shores. And in these settings, either here in these territories or back home in my own territory, students get to understand more about themselves because of that year of preparation. They get to understand something about what has either already been revealed to them or what occurs to them, what is given to them in that moment when they're in that space. Now, you might think, how does this work in an academic context? How you might translate that? I don't think you can translate it. It's something that's experiential, it's phenomenological, it has its own sort of affectivity that is engraved on people's hearts and minds in different ways. And so it just has to be taken for what it is and its own purposes. But I do also like to say that it's a form of intention setting in relationship to not only the work that you're doing, but also your relationship to the broader view. And so this idea of a vision quest, which is called a Pawajigewin, is something that has been historically present as we're trying to organize our affairs, and is also contemporarily available, including, of course, within an academic context. It's also the case I did this as a young man myself. And I remember the experiences I had out in the forest. There were beautiful silver beech trees and oak and maple trees, some amazing huge white pine trees, and the forest was just teeming with life. And I learned so much more about myself, and I received specific understanding about how I might continue to act in relationship to some of the things that were important to me in that area. It's often the case that people will not share their vision quest with you. It's meant to be close to you, but it is the case that you're supposed to live in relationship to that vision. So it is for application, but it's not just necessarily for broadcasting what it is that you learned in that setting. Now, there's another kind of tradition that often happens in homes of Anishinaabe people, where they might ask one another in the morning, "Awegunain ga puajigayan," what did you dream last night? And as they're in that setting, there's an encouragement to be able to share and to understand and to seek out different ideas about what those dreams might have been as you were sleeping the night before. You often find that when you're sleeping, your daytime thoughts organize themselves, and they organize themselves around metaphor, they organize themselves around image, and so you get new insights into what it might be that you had been done during your waking life. And so to ask Awegunain ga puajigayan is to encourage people to reflect upon that experience and try to understand its relationship to who you are, who you would like to be. And often, of course, these things aren't easy to explain, which is why it's important to talk with one another about them, so that you in a community can work out some of the possibilities that might be present in that fashion. And I'm grateful for that. Sometimes because people have drawn me out with my dreams, I've been able to learn some things about myself that weren't otherwise apparent. And sometimes it's allowed me to be a better writer. And in fact, this entire book was written in that way. My daughter at the time was maybe about 13, maybe 14. And I've been a runner for about 40 years. And so we would go running in the morning and we would ask these questions. Awegunain ga puajigayan, what did you dream last night? And I would hear from her. We would talk about her dreams. And then I would, as she asked me the same question, talk about my dreams in the same light. And as I was doing so over about a month or so, sometimes when you lay your head down on your pillow just before you go to sleep, if you're used to doing this, you can have a little bit of a flash about what it is that you dreamt about last night. I guess as you're just in that drifting space, some of those things seem to come back a little bit. And then every once in a while, you find yourself almost serial dreaming. Not that you would exactly pick up where the dream left off the night before, it's never that simple, but you find a relationship between what's happening night after night after night. And so as I was running in the morning, talking with my daughter, explaining these things, I realized that there was a book that was developing in that setting. And so I started to write down some of the things that my daughter had talked with me about, I talked with her about, and also what I was experiencing in my sleep time, which related to what was happening in my waking hours. And so with that, I eventually got a few chapters together and I started calling home and sharing what I learned with my mother and father and sister, always so supportive for them to be able to hear in their ear the things that I was sharing. And so over the kind of 2 months or so, I ended up writing the bulk of this book. And then I went home during our powwow season. And when I did so, they were very gracious to sit for a couple of weeks, maybe for about an hour a morning. And I would just read one of the 16 chapters that was found in the book. And in reading those chapters, I further refined, further reflected at what was going on. And then I left it for a while. I can't remember if it was a year or years that I left it, but I just didn't want to jump right into it And so that was that experience. And then I realized that what I was seeing in those dreams as I was going along had these images attached to them. And these images are the way Anishinaabe people historically recorded our information, which was on birch bark scrolls. So at the beginning of each chapter, there's these images that are related to the dreams that are found within the book. So that the idea is that if you became familiar with the book, you might be able to read the scrolls and not necessarily go to the English text and to try to find things in that regard. Just stepping away here for a sec, just to show you what they eventually looked like as I put them onto the birch bark themselves with my mother a year later. And so I have the text in that fashion with the text also being what you see published by the University of Toronto Press. But if you can see here, there's these little images in the scrolls. Here's a Mishabiju, and here's a bear, and etc. And so that was another dimension of how this book was put together. And it's important for me that it was at the powwow time of year that I sort of tried to bring this to a point, because the word powwow is it's a contraction of the word Pawajigewin. Pawajigewin. Powwow is a dream. Pawajigewin. And so what happens on a powwow field is that people will bring to their bodies through their dance the hopes and images that they've dreamed into that circle. And as you know, there are many different dances there. There's the grass dance and traditional, and men's fancy dance and jingle dress, and these other forms, including intertribal dancing, where people are bringing to the physical world those things that they dreamed about. So if you look at someone's regalia, you might often see things that are related to the in-between worlds. So you think about the eagle feathers, for instance. These can be attached to the different dancers' regalia. And there's something about that world of connectivity between the sky and the earth that happens with the feathers. This in Anishinaabe one is called miigwan. Miigwan is the word for feather. And it's so strong, and yet it's so gentle, right? This will lift an entire bird despite its weight, because of the way all of these different fibers are put together ever so slightly on the feather of a bird, in this particular case, an eagle. And if you want to think about power or leadership and how you would exercise leadership within Anishinaabe communities, you would do it historically gently, right? This is the hope and the model as to the way we would try to lead out, is in ways that aren't threatening, but in ways that are uplifting, that are encouraging, and that are, that are overlapping, like you see feathers together. Anyways, in the powwow, that's just one example of many different images that people will dream about and put into their regalia. And then there might be dances that have come into being because of dreams, or the particular person might dance in that regard as well. And then when you hear the drums, they also sound out in that sense of calling upon the different realms of who we are as people, and that many of the songs are products of dreams, and if they're not the products of dreams, they're meant again to filter in that regard. So here we are with vision quests, putting people out on land as young people, as graduate students, my own experience in the forest as I was a young person, talking with my daughter, developing a relationship with my family, developing a relationship with my mother, putting things into different forms of writing with scrolls and texts as a part of a Pawajigewin, trying to embody the dreams that we have. When I started as a professor at the University of British Columbia Law School, I was very lonely and very homesick, being on the other side of the country where I had grown up, right? I was teaching at the University of British Columbia Law School, and I was the director of the First Nations legal program, and that's where I got to know Christopher Bracken when I was just a young and new professor in that state. And he was also a graduate student at that time as well, writing about the potlatch and other things. So I was enjoying the people that I was getting to know, and I thought it was physically beautiful, but I just really had this sense of aching and longing to be back in the Great Lakes and to be back home again. And so it was in that state one night that I fell asleep and I had a dream. And in that dream, I returned back home. And as I returned back home, I was visiting with my mother and father and my aunties, and we were catching up and sharing about all the things that had gone on since I'd last been with them. It was good food and good laughter. And I just remember in that dream having that feeling of being home again, of traveling home. And then at the end of that time in my dream, after visiting with my mother and aunts in their homes, we said, well, let's go down to the lake. Let's take a walk. Let's actually get in the car and go down to the lake. And so we climbed in the car and we started driving to the lake. And as we drove to the lake, it's as beautiful as always. If you can imagine what Georgian Bay looks like, it's just this huge expanse of an inland ocean or inland sea. And there's little islands that are just off of the coast of the shore. And they're often covered in pine trees. So as we drove down to the lake, we saw this incredible expanse of water. And then we saw this island just off the shore with this amazing pine tree. And on the pine tree was a limb with its arm extending back towards the shore. And as we got closer to the rim of the water, we started to make up that something or someone was on the limb of that pine tree. And we were curious about that. So we got closer, pulled out of our car, and then started walking towards the lip of the bay. And then we saw that there was actually a man sitting in that pine tree on that branch whose arms extended back towards the shore. And we wondered what this person was doing. And as the person caught our eye, he suddenly lifted something out of this pile of sticks that was in front of him there on that branch. And so that branch was there, this pile of sticks, and he lifted this little object out of that pile of sticks. And we noticed that it was a baby eaglet. And we were sort of confused, and we saw him set that baby eaglet on the side of the nest. And then he again caught our eyes, locked our eyes with his, and then he cast that baby eaglet over the side of the nest, and it was too young to fly, and it fell to the water below and flapped around and drowned in that space. Well, we were just incensed by what was happening and shocked that this would occur. And so what happened was we started to say, stop, what are you doing? This is not who we are, this is inappropriate. And so we were, trying to cause him to change his behavior. But as he did so, same thing happened again. He locks his eyes with ours. And as we're yelling at him, he lifts another baby eaglet onto the side of the nest. And without feeling, as we're trying to stop him, just lets go. And again, down that eaglet goes into the water, and it drowns there in that space. Well, I was upset at this point, and so what I do is I then go rushing off of the shore and into the water, wading through that knee-deep water to get to the island. And as I'm doing so, this man is looking at me again, just seemingly passive, and I then suddenly I arrive at the island. I start climbing up the tree. As I climb up the tree, he does the same thing once more and casts this baby eaglet down into the water below. And it was just traumatic. And eventually, though, I was able to secure him. And so I got him off of the branch and down the trunk and across the island and back through the knee-deep water onto the shore. And by that time, because I had been causing all this commotion, yelling and trying to stop what was going on, there were people that had gathered around the side of the shore. and they were watching what I was doing and watching this all unfold. And they didn't say a thing. And I was surprised because this is something that obviously needed attention, but they were just silent and they were watchful. And I think just waiting to see what would happen. And so as I come to the shore with this man, the band constable steps forward, and he steps forward to me and he says, "I'm arresting you." I was taken back. Why? Why are you arresting me? Because you're here disturbing the peace. Look at all these people that you've brought out of their homes, and you're causing grief because of your agitation. I'm arresting you. Again, I was taken back, and I said to him, "But I just came home to visit my Auntie Norma." And he said, "Oh, you're Auntie Norma. Oh, I know who you are. You're John. I heard you were away at school, and oh, you're back. Oh." And so once he knew who I was, then he said, "You are free to go." And so he let me go, and I was on my way. And I then woke up from the dream, left to ponder what it was that was being taught in that dream. And so through time, I've had some reflections on that as I've talked with others and my family in particular. And one of those lessons was that when I am trying to get involved in the work that is important to me, I must be careful to ensure that I am a part of the communities that I'm trying to connect with. Otherwise, what might occur is people might just watch you silently and see what's going to go on and leave you to your own devices, right? And that's never, not never, but it's not often a good thing to be in that situation where you're separated from that community that you're trying to work with. I also thought about why these people were standing around so silently and just watching and not doing anything to get involved with what needed to take place. This was 1992. And I recognized that there's a lot of trauma in our community where people are waiting and are silent because either their voice or their situation has been such that it's hard to get involved or put yourself out there because you just have to take care of so many other things that are part of your day-to-day affairs. So that was another reflection there too. But then I thought later about this, wondering, I wonder if I'm also the man in the nest. That is, in my attempts to do things that I think are good, might I actually be taking the power of our future and just without much appreciation casting that away over the sides of our nest and watch it drown in the depths of the waters below. And so, that caused me a little bit of self-reflection and through time has returned to me. I want to make sure that I'm not taking what is important to us and just dropping it into the water prematurely and such that it can't fly and can't fulfill its place. So that was the dream, and there's more meaning to that I've come to through the years, but that was an important setting for me as a law professor. Keep connected to your community, recognize the trauma that's there within the community, and don't be the person that is messing around with power that you shouldn't be messing around with. So this was all, though, reinforced to me, this dream. I think this is why I partially remembered it so strongly, is because I had been invited that next morning to get up to Kwakwiyuth territory, to Kinkum Inlet, to the Muskama Zawadeno people. And so after I woke up, I got dressed and I went to a taxi to the Vancouver airport, and I got in a plane and I flew to Campbell River. And then from Campbell River, we went from the airport to the harbor, and I got in a float plane, and we flew from Campbell River in a float plane over to Kinkum Inlet. And then I got out of the float plane into a boat, and we made our way up this river in the springtime. And then we got out of the boat and into a car. And then finally we were in this beautiful, beautiful village. And this place of Kinkum Inlet is a place of ancient life. And while I was there, we just feasted. We lived on the sort of just what surrounded us. Ernie Willie was my host there. And I went with Judge Alfred Scow. Alfred Scow was the first lawyer called to the bar in British Columbia, the first judge in British Columbia, and he wanted to work on the revitalization of Kwagilth law in relationship to his home community there. And so he was there with me, along with Deloyd Guth, who is a legal historian from UBC, and Nancy Sandy, a Schwetmuk lawyer who subsequently became my graduate student about 20 years later. And we were learning about Kwagilth law in this site. And they have this statement that when the tide goes out, your table is set. And so when the tide went out, we would have clam fritters and mussels, and we would have halibut and salmon and all sorts of seaweed, and of course deer. It was a feast. It was an incredible experience that we had together. And we really enjoyed those 4 days learning about Kwagilth law. But at the end of the time that we were there, my host, Ernie Willie, he took us into their big house. Big houses are barn-like structures from the outside. They are just of wood and sort of framed without too much ceremony. That is, you wouldn't really know, except for the front piece where there's a screen or poles that indicate that this is a set apart place, a sacred place. And so he took us inside the big house, and he took us to the 4 poles that we saw that sat in each corner. And at the end of the big house is again a big screen where behind that people would prepare for their potlatches and bring to life their ceremonies, their laws in that regard. And as we went from pole to pole, he would point to the different crests there, the different clans that were there, and he would tell me stories about them. And he would talk about these figures who connected these people to that territory, that placed them there from a time beyond memory. And so there was so many lessons and so many places of connectivity there. But when he got to the last pole, and we went around in this direction, someone had taken an axe to the pole and they had partially defaced it. And he was very saddened by that, and of course not as fulsome in his expressions of appreciation as he had been with the other poles. And he said, look at this. He said, this is what our people have done in the day of their sadness. They've turned against that which would most help them remember who they are. And we've suffered as a result of that. He says, this pole stands as a reminder that we must never again forget who we are. And it was a really sobering lesson. And I can remember standing in silence for a while, just taking that in, and then stepping out into the big house and seeing this territory that's filled with these animals and spirits and clans and houses, and then looking up and seeing these beautiful eagles that were just soaring above the area. And that was a huge important lesson to me in relationship to what's happening is that sometimes our young ones aren't able to grow or be nourished like they could because things have been taken to our ways and defaced. And so they're not growing to be our grandmothers and our grandfathers like they could be with these wings of eagles that allow that kind of vision to take place as they circle around our lives. And so that was another piece of connectivity in relationship to dreaming. And I continued to work on what that meant to me through the years as I wrote articles about and then started teaching about how all of our laws are related to our stories, and they're related to things we can't see that might come to us in dreams, that might come to us through our language or songs, but they can be talked about, and we can find ways to revitalize those laws. So there was a time about, maybe it was 2003, I was in Australia, and I had started at University of Victoria in 2001. So 1992 is when I had that dream. I started at UVic in 2001. In between that time, I went back to teach at Osgoode Hall Law School, the University of Toronto, to be back in my territories, but came back to British Columbia. And in 2003, I was dreaming, and I had this sense of a law school that could be an Indigenous law school. And I just talked with my family about it, where we might be teaching Indigenous law using songs, using dances, using stories, finding people engaging with our own normativity as Indigenous peoples. That is, our standards, principles, signposts, guideposts, measures, authorities, traditions, precedents for regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes. And then I went over to Australia for a sabbatical at the University of New South Wales, and one of my colleagues was there, Jeremy Weber, who had been at McGill and then was the dean of actually University of Sydney. He had just been hired at the University of Victoria. And I knew he had taught at McGill Law School before. And at McGill Law School, they teach the common law and the civil law together in what they call trans-systemic ways. That is, a problem is presented, and then you look at that problem from the common law perspective, and you look at that problem from the civil law perspective, and you can see how they differently treat that issue, and how they sometimes might have some harmonization as to how they treat that issue. And so we were on the beach in Australia in a place called Woy Woy, just north of Sydney, where his wife's family is from. And I said, as we were floating in the water, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had an Indigenous law degree in Canada that was trans-systemic, teaching the common law alongside Indigenous law? And he said, yeah, that would be great. And he explained to me the process of getting the trans-systemic legal education into place in Montreal with common law and civil law. And he said, let's work on that back in Victoria. And so I felt that encouragement. And so when I came back, I started teaching or talking with my colleague, at that time Dean, Andrew Petter. Andrew Petter had been in government, and then he was our dean of the law school at that time. And I shared this vision with him that I talked about with Jeremy. And of course, had experienced all these years along in other places with writing and etc. And he said, yeah, that would be a good idea. He encouraged me. And so we started putting it together. I developed a curriculum. I talked with my colleagues about different components. We started workshopping different elements and piloting them, summer courses, field courses, trans-systemic courses in the classroom, inviting elders in, going out to communities. And then I can remember one day being at the Mungo Martin Big House, which is right by the British Columbia Royal Museum, where we had a gathering there. And Maxine Madelpy, a Kwagioth woman, was our director of Indigenous Affairs at the law school at that time. And at that place, I shared that dream that I had. It was about 2000 and maybe 8 or 9. And there was support in that context. And so from that, we started just building all of these networks of support. We had over 600 meetings with people back in Ottawa. We had dozens and dozens of meetings with people here in British Columbia. We met with national Indigenous organizations. We did a lot of work with local Indigenous organizations. We talked to judges' education conferences, the Indigenous Bar Association, the Canadian Bar Association, trying to hear all the critiques of this idea. So if we shouldn't do it, we would not do it. And if there were better ways to do it, we would learn about what those better ways of doing it are. And so through the period of time, we eventually got approval for this program. And now we're in our 3rd year of operation, where students learn trans-systemically. They learn the common law alongside Indigenous law. So I teach Anishinaabe constitutionalism here, which is how we are constituting as Ojibwe, Chippewa, Anishinaabe people, and how that's in our stories and our dreams and our songs and our dances, how it's in our research, and how it's also written now as well. There's constitutions. There's over 43 Anishinaabe communities that have passed constitutions, Chinookanagewans, that have our 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings in them. And then there's other written sources that you could go to. And in the meantime, I had a 5-year stint teaching law at the University of Minnesota Law School. So I had a chance to advance my language skills. I'm still not fluent, but I do run a language table here, and we have lots of fun because I'm always misspeaking. But advance my language skills, but also taught tribal courts classes. And so in the United States, there's tribal courts. And so here's a book of over 1,000 pages where the tradition is in written form there. And so we can take the unwritten and the written form and put them together and start to teach Indigenous law in that way and bring out the narratives that might be narratives that are found in cases, but also those cases, those Anishinaabe judges might be citing language, might be talking about dreams that the elders share. They might be actually bringing out an old trickster story, a Nana Bojo, and analogizing it to the things that are before them. And so this world of living into dreams is a world that is about trying to pay attention to Anishinaabe law on its own terms, and then figuring out what we can gain by comparing and contrasting that with the other traditions. So as the same time I'm teaching Anishinaabe constitutionalism, I also teach Canadian constitutionalism, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, federalism, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. And when the students go outside of my class, then they'll take Cree law and criminal law. And they'll learn how Cree law has a duty to rescue when someone's in trouble in their legal system, whereas the criminal code says you don't have a duty to rescue if you see someone in trouble. Anyways, that's one example of a year long of comparisons and contrasts that happen on that front. And then someone else will teach Silcotin law and the laws of voluntary obligations or contract law. And another person will teach Hulkaminam law, which is law here on the island. And they'll correlate that, comparing and contrasting that with involuntary obligations or tort law. And then my colleague Val Napoleon teaches property law from a common law perspective, at the same time teaching Gitsan relationships to land and the natural world. And so the students do that in the classroom for a couple of years, but then they also have 2 field schools that they do, one in their 3rd year and one in their 4th year, working in communities, immersed in communities, in their laws and in Canadian law. And then the community poses questions to the students that they then try to answer through memos and papers that pick up the task of dealing with the questions that people have in their communities. And so by the time the students are finished, they've got a comparative sense of Indigenous laws, just from a few nations' perspectives. They've also had 2 immersion experiences within communities. And of course, they've learned the common law alongside this all the way along, so that they can go eventually, if they want an article, and get called to the bar. This way of proceeding is a way of proceeding that sees the trickster in action as you compare and you contrast and you recognize you can't always reconcile things together, but it's also a way of engaging with one another that recognizes that wisdom can come from many places, and we also have a need to distinguish ourselves from others in many places as well. So it's a wonderful experience to be a part of here with these students as they come to us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from coast to coast to coast. They get a JD, which is a Juris Doctorate in the common law, and a JID, which is a Juris Indigenous Doctorate in Indigenous laws. And that learning experience takes us outside. It takes us through different worlds, including the world of narrative, including the world of story, including the world of dream. So that's a little bit about drawing out law and just thinking through what the possibilities are that lie around us, and trying to revitalize our ways, try to see that resurgence be a part of what we're living into. And I look forward to any questions or comments that you might have in the 15 minutes that remain as you think about what might be related to the things that are happening in your life, or questions, critical comments, or otherwise. I just welcome any thoughts you might have, because this is still a work in progress, right? It's not finished, and it will never finish. It's always a part of a learning journey that I'm on, and here we are as students, and other faculty also trying to engage in that journey as well. So, miigwech bizindueg you, ahau, thank you, and look forward to any comments you might have.
Thank you, John, for another great talk. So to the audience, you can raise your virtual hand, which should be under participants somewhere, I think. You can pose a question on chat, or you could turn on your camera and wave your hands in real time. So Johanna Bird has raised her hand first. Thank you, Johanna. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for your talk, John. I haven't read your book, Drawing Law, yet, so I could understand that perhaps my question might be answered in your book. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the relationship you see between law and story. So I come from an Indigenous literary studies angle, not from the field of law. And so I'm wondering, if you could talk about your approach to seeking and identifying law in stories. Does that include Indigenous stories more broadly, or more what we would call quote unquote traditional stories? And how, like, when is a story contributing to our sense of Anishinaabe or Cree law, and when is it just a story about Nana Bojo being silly? You know what? So I'm just wondering if you talk more about your methodology and how you see the law and literature story relating. Thank you.
Thank you for that great question. And the stories always exist in layers, right? And they have their own context, and they can be that is repurposed for different settings. And that's the way I perceive them in my own life. And so that's important to recognize. They're not always about law. Sometimes it is Nana Bojo being silly. Sometimes it is entertainment, but sometimes there's the 3 or 4 other things going on at the same moment, which is the brilliance of them because of the layers of depth that's there. Now, we have many types of stories as Anishinaabe people. Some of our stories are called Adazu Kanag, and Adazu Kanag are stories that are living. They have their own spirit, and there is this sort of almost time beyond time nature to them. So the animals talk, and the world speaks to you, and the figures that are present in them you might not necessarily know from kind of more recent historical experience. The fact that they're living means that they need to be feasted. You need to give that time and attention through smudging and food and respect. But they can be a part of our lives. It's been said that tradition can be the dead faith of living people or the living faith of dead people. And unless we take tradition and make it a part of who we are, it becomes the dead faith of us who are living. Right? But if we can take them in ways that are applicable, then they become the living faith of those that have passed before us, the living faith of dead people. And so Adazu Kanag can function in that fashion. Then we also have Dabajamoanan. And Dabajamoanan are the stories that are of more recent vintage. It could be like a 400-year recent vintage, but you can recognize characters and how they might proceed, and some of them might be as new as yesterday. And on my lecture tomorrow night, I'm going to tell one of those stories I had the pleasure to be involved with about 2 or 3 years ago at Cape Croker. And what the methodology there is understanding what are the issues that are presented in this story, and how might those issues be similar to or different from the ones that we encounter as scholars or as people hoping to practice law, or grannies and uncles and aunts, or educators or healthcare workers. How do we relate to them by analogy or distinguishing them? And once you've identified the issue and thought about your relationship to them, then you can ask the question, what was the decision that was taken in that story? What was the outcome? And then once you understand how they resolve that outcome, you can look into, so what were the reasons for that? Why did it turn out that way? And so you then start to enter into a conversation with the story across the generations and across people that are living to try to figure out, does this story have any application in this present setting? And again, I said in the past lecture, beware the danger of a single story. You would never say, I know law now because I know one case. You need to know how that area of law has interacted across a series of cases in order to give some sense of meaning that might be there. And likewise with Anishinaabe law, you would have to get a sense of how the stories kind of relate to one another to make sure that you're not just choosing an outlier or choosing some small piece of a wider canon that doesn't necessarily represent the rest of that canon. And so talking together about this is really where all the action is, learning from one another in that setting so that then individually we can go forward and live the law in our own lives, because that's where Anishinaabe law should be most deeply rooted, is in our own selves. We really want to respect the agency of others. But if it is the case that collectively we want to develop something that is going to perhaps have application to others, then we also want to be participatory in that setting as well. We have an Indigenous law research unit here in UVic that works with 43 different communities, and they follow that kind of methodology in helping communities think about where normativity might be embedded in their stories, both contemporarily told and more historic. So thanks for that question. Hopefully that's helpful a little bit, and then you'll find more as you look through the Drawing Out Loud book.
Yeah, if I could just ask hopefully a quick follow-up question. So then law, as you're talking about it, like earlier you talked about precedents, principles. So you think of and talk about law broadly, perhaps in terms of like relational ethics, guiding principles, normativity. We could think of grounded normativity.
So I'm thinking about law from an Anishinaabe perspective, which is an Akonagewin, Kinwejawewin, Manidu, Kagagewin, Ijatuawanan, and that sense of law is, as I've been trying to describe, whereas what the common law talks about is parliaments and legislatures that enact statutes that could be interpreted by courts, that are assisted by judges and lawyers and maybe enforced by the police. And so I'm trying to cause us to think about law as something we do. It's a verb. As I said the first day, it's something we conjugate and we participate in, as opposed to something that's just done to us. Now, there is a place in Anishinaabe law for making proclamations, declarations. Maybe an institution might do that, a band council or a society or a family or a clan. But to just see that as law and not all this other stuff as law, I think would be missing that broader set of resources that we have, again, to resolve disputes and regulate or coordinate our behavior together.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I see 3 questions on the table, so maybe John, you could answer them in the order they were posed. So Sally Ann has a very concise question on chat. Then David Gay has his hand up, and then Brandon Carefoot has another question on chat. So Sally Ann's concise question is, what about IP law? Yes,
in fact, that was the Christmas or the December exam I set for my constitutional law students, is how might intellectual property and cultural property benefit from understanding Anishinaabe law. And it was a wonderful experience that those students went through, pulling on both those streams of law that are Anishinaabe, and then also looking to Canadian law and where there might be support for that and what they need to overcome, because Canadian law will marginalize Indigenous IP and Indigenous cultural property. And I was really proud of my students. They did a fantastic job of taking that issue on.
Okay, David. There you go.
Thank you very much. That was tremendously enjoyable and informative and stimulating lecture. I'm entirely on the literary side. I'm an English teacher, I'm teaching an undergraduate course in Shakespeare, who has a lot of dreams, of course, in his work. Next week, I'm looking forward to inviting Renelta Arluck, who's written a Cree takeover of Macbeth, but that's in the future, so I can't touch on that now. Set on Treaty 6 territory. This week, we did Measure for Measure, which is one of those very legalistic plays you may know, where a cold, terrible law with making fornication a capital crime is imposed in Europe, in Vienna. And I decided to have an exercise for the class in what is called the legal imagination, something I picked up from old law school friends who used literature, usually European literature, to exercise their legal imagination. Here I gave them a precept from a legal scholar at the U of T Law School, Simon Stern, who I guess has written a book on the legal imagination, and their task was to reflect on this. In the law, the imagination operates under constraint, whereas in many fields, imaginative activity is associated with free play. And so constraint is very clear in the play that I was setting for them. I wonder if you could react to that, and thinking about imagination in dreams, imagination in literature, and whether you would agree that the legal imagination is necessarily constrained, and whether your work could set it free.
Thank you. Great question. And what a fascinating set of engagements you're having, especially that rewriting through a Cree perspective. So I think law is about constraint and free play simultaneously. Sometimes we find freedom because there's a discipline attached to what we do that is a constraint, but nevertheless that constraint, by say practicing the piano every day for 4 years, then gives you the freedom to be able to play the piano. So that the idea of constraint and freedom, constraint and free play aren't necessarily dichotomous. They could be productively related to one another. I hope my work, though, does create some free play that removes some of the constraints that are a part of the Canadian legal system. And there's a whole framework that court has developed that invites Indigenous law into that place, and which allows for some disruption of the common law. And so that's definitely a part of my work. And then also the trying to understand that Indigenous law itself has constraint, but it's a different kind of constraint that would be found in the common law. It's not necessarily about locking people up in prison or coming down on them with a coercive hand, although there can be aspects of coercion within Indigenous law for sure. But it's like I was saying to Johanna's question, it's also trying to plant the normativity within a person such that they are constrained of their own choice, as it were, so that then with that constraint, they find those places that they can play. And so, yeah, if I can make those 2 points, that constraint and free play are related to one another. And then what I'm trying to do is remove some of the constraints of the common law, but recognize it's not a free-for-all. Once you get to Indigenous law, it itself has its own set of expectations that places channeling into the way we might act.
Thank you.
And I teach a course in Native law, Indigenous law and literature, and we have a great experience with the students going through some of those questions.
Okay, thank you. So we now have 2 questions on chat, one from Brandon first and then one from Catherine.
Great. Brandon asks, what advice would you give to people who can't remember their dreams? Learn from other people's dreams. It's so powerful to be a sounding board for other folks. And in that process, you're part of the developing of that community, and there's insight, there's opportunity for learning that could come from that place. I don't think I have any advice about conjuring dreams, although I do know that Indigenous peoples have a rich ceremonial life that tries to encourage the reflexivity, the watchfulness, the observation, the internal sort of cogitation, as it were. But I don't think that even if you went through all that, you would necessarily produce a dream out the other end of that. People just have different gifts, and if it's not dreaming, there's, like my talk was trying to introduce yesterday, there's so many other paths that people can take. Can beware the danger of a single story, or practice nuance is sacred. And there's ways you can get involved in the dream world with others, but there's maybe other things that can be picked up and found as a way to participate with the community around the creation of the normativity that you're trying to live by. And I see Catherine's question here: how have students described their experiences in the JD/JID programming, balancing the very heavy reading load with the JD of internalizing Indigenous law so it lives within them? I think each person would describe that somewhat differently, because obviously they come from different nations and are Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And it is a struggle to make sure that the common law, the JD reading, doesn't overtake the other work. And there are some times where it is more reading heavy. There's other times when it's more experiential. Hopefully that all sort of evens out by the end of the time here, but probably not. There's probably some ways that one part is more heavier than the others as they're going through it, and then at the end as well. All we can do is, as teachers, try to give attention to those different ways of engaging with thoughtfulness and care. And it's not easy, I have to say. It's a challenging thing to be involved in, but it's also incredibly richly rewarding. One, because of the brilliance of the students and what they bring to this, because the experiential is with the students, with one another, and with yourself. And then also the other piece is just the communities themselves and how they encourage the students as they interact with them.
Other questions? Is there a question I'm not seeing, for example? I'm going to go back to gallery view to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Okay, scanning. Maybe I'll ask a question then. Keep this ball rolling. So John, you mentioned UBC in the 90s. You were actually one of the readers of my dissertation. Fresh out of graduate school yourself. I remember a few things about that time. First of all, it was very hard to do any kind of serious research in the field of Indigenous studies because so much work was yet to be done. And Indigenous people were treated as if they were the property of anthropologists and historians, judges and government administrators. And at the same time, there was this enormous resistance to the suggestion that other fields of knowledge might be infiltrated by narrative forms or by stories. And there was even resistance among literary scholars to the possibility of taking seriously what Paula Gunn Allen memorably called non-ordinary states of consciousness. One of my favorite euphemisms and efforts to get around an obstacle. So you talked about sharing your dreams with your family. What happens when you share your dreams with the court or the legal establishment in Canada? Yesterday in the symposium, you mentioned that kind of historical trauma known as the trial judgment in Delgama versus British Columbia, where the judge basically expressed every prejudice that was out there. How does this go down outside the law school? Are you still encountering resistance, or is that hope that you held out 20 years ago that reconciliation would be a process of mutual transformation? Is that hope being fulfilled?
So I'm a lawyer, and so my answer is it depends. But I think it's a very accurate answer, because in some places what we're doing is encouraged and understood, and people engage with it, and their own multidisciplinary insights come to bear, and we're facilitating our work because of that mutual or reciprocal elucidation that goes on. And so there's some activity that is wonderful in that regard. And then there are places of resistance. I have to say, not so explicit, but just the lack of interest, the lack of funding in some areas, the lack of hiring of faculty or recruiting of students into the field. And that's different in different places across the country, but it's there. The most challenging part of this is to get our own selves to recognize that there's something deeply rigorous and powerful and academically insightful and enriching to the psyche within our traditions. And because it's an easy off-ramp to go and practice Canadian law as it relates to Indigenous peoples, or go and do the things that are already set up, that have their own long established pathways to work and scholarship. And so that's the biggest piece, is believing, I suppose, in our own selves, as it were. But I do see the hope. I've been doing this for 28 years now, and I have so many students that are living things that I've been talking about, that are, they are drafting constitutions and sitting on tribal courts, or they're out with their families, participating in these other less ordinary ways of proceeding. And so I see all of that present. And when I interview, sometimes I just put it right out there. I can remember I interviewed at the University of Toronto in 1996 and told a story about a dream in my job talk. And I said, if they don't want that, I don't want to be here. And fortunately, they felt it was good enough anyways, that I got that position at U of T at that time. So sometimes you just have to put it out there, and that was a happy experience. Other times I put it out there and it's fell on deaf ears, and you say, well, there'll be another time.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question on chat from Harold.
Yes, it says, maybe it's too late for this question, but what promise does the passage and implementation of the Federal Indigenous Language Act bring with it in relationship to language and the law? Put it another way, what are your hopes for the legislation? I wish that legislation was resourced. It's really good to have the recognition and pathways for having further work occur on Indigenous languages. But we need the teachers in the schools, and we need the students in the classes that feel incentivized to see a future in maybe being language teachers, or seeing how this language would help them as a lawyer or a literary scholar, or whatever the path that they want to take will be. There are more speakers of language, second speakers of Indigenous language, than there are first speakers. On the one hand, that's bad news, because we want to have many first speakers of Indigenous languages. But on the other hand, it's good news, which shows that there are many people that have this desire to become second language speakers of their sort of ethnic or Indigenous language opportunities. And I just think that legislation is a great place to start, but now it needs to be implemented with much greater force and support.
Very good. So I'm going to scan for questions again. Everything takes a while in Zoom land. Remember, you can raise your e-hand, or you can wave your real hand. For those of you who can type, can chat. Okay, I'm not seeing another question. Maybe this would be an opportune time to wrap. We're always concerned about Zoom fatigue.
Yes.
and wearing out our audience these days. I'll thank you again, John, for another great lecture. Wait, we have another question from Allison. Maybe you could answer that. That could be our last question, and then we could wrap up.
There's about 20 legal scholars that are doing what I'm doing, and maybe another 30, 40 graduate students that are working in this field. And so there is a community that I have that I didn't have when I started in 1992. And thank you everyone for being here. I know there is Zoom fatigue, and I really appreciate just being able to be with you, and that you've stayed here this long. And I look forward to other events that are happening tomorrow and Friday. And Chris might say a thing or two about that, but I want to say thank you so much, everyone. And back to you, Chris.
Okay, so I posted my email again if you want to join John in his office hours on Friday. My apologies to those who tried to join today and were unsuccessful. So we have two events tomorrow. There's a meeting with graduate students at 10, all times Mountain Time. And there is a reading if you have time to do it or want to do it. It's The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. And I've also shared with Mark Simpson, the Associate Chair of Grad Studies in English and Film Studies, a couple essays on related issues by Sarah Deer and Jessica Owens. There's also an evening talk starting at 6:30 Mountain Time tomorrow. So that the reason for the evening time slot is that this is what the university calls the town and gown session. You don't have to wear a gown if you don't want to, but certainly you can if you do. But what that means is it's an effort to bridge the gap between the university and the surrounding community. That explains the later time slot. The basic idea is to make the live lecture available when people have finished work and perhaps even had dinner or recovered from work. So it's addressed to the larger community, though this event is really changing all of those assumptions. Interesting facts, we're having people join from across the country, and we're also having a lot of activity asynchronously. So these talks are being viewed on YouTube after they're over. And there's been quite a bit of interest. So join me again in thanking John Burroughs for his wonderful talk and his insight. And we can do this with emoticons.
Thank you, everyone, and take care. Gigawabman.
Okay. Thanks, John. We'll sign off now.